All right guys, today we're gonna talk about tuning up your table saw. Now the table saw is the workhorse of my shop and I do about 90% of my work on the table saw, so it's very important that everything be straight and in line, otherwise that results in a lot more burning, a lot more crooked cuts, and a hell of a lot more swearing. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're gonna do is align the blade to the miter slot. Put a couple pennies down in the miter slot just to help me raise this little strip off of the table. I'm gonna drop this strip in, which will give me a little lip to measure off of. Now, what I wanna do is I wanna choose one tooth that I'm gonna take all of my measurements off of. So I'm gonna pick this tooth here, I'm gonna put a little black dot on it, and I'm going to take all my measurements for this process off of this one tooth. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna align my square up to that tooth, and so I can just barely hear it. So once I have that, I'm gonna go ahead and circle the blade back, and we have a tiny gap there. What that tells me is that I need to adjust the top of my saw. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove 3 bolts from the underside of my saw, and you're gonna need to look in your manual to see what bolts you need to remove. And I'm going to use a dead blow hammer to adjust the top of my saw so that it's in line. What I'm gonna do is use this jig from Woodpeckers to give me a little bit more of an accurate measurement. And what it'll do is it'll tell me how far off I am and how much I actually need to move the top of my table. Now you can use the earlier method, it works just fine, but I do have this gauge, so I'm going to use that to set up my saw. All right, and we definitely wanna move it. So it looks like we're about 7,000 inside. The workpiece is actually getting pinched against the fence. We're gonna make that adjustment by, again, removing those 3 bolts on the bottom, not all 4, because we don't wanna move the whole table. And we're gonna move the top of the table using a dead blow hammer. So let's go ahead and get that. All right, so we've made our adjustments and now I'm gonna test everything again. I'm going right back to that same tooth that we had marked earlier. I'm gonna use a square, I'll lock that down. Just barely hear it. That same tooth back here, and we just barely hear that. Seems like we're set up right. Let's go ahead and pop this out and drop our gauge in and see how close we are on the gauge. For our gauge, we wanna be about 2 inches in on the blade. Set it to 0. Go 2 inches, and we're under by about a little under 1/1000. So I think that's fine. It's okay that the blade's turned out a little bit. It's much safer than if the blade was turned in. For the most part, we're good to go. Now, I will say adjusting the top of the table saw took a lot longer, so make sure you leave yourself enough time to make those fine adjustments. I ended up going ahead and loosening all 4 bolts and then kind of using a mallet to rough it in, and then tightening down 1 bolt and using the mallet to fine tune the fit to make sure that everything was in line. So it does get frustrating and you probably will rack your knuckles, but hopefully, you'll come through it and you'll be all right. All right, so next we're gonna check that the fence is square, and to do that, I'm gonna use just a square. I'm gonna line it up with the edge of my fence and just see if there's any light. And when you're checking for square, make sure you do so on the center of your table saw, not on the extension wing, since those can dip just a little bit. You wanna make sure that you're square to the top of the tabletop. So as you can see, we got a little light there, so we're gonna make some adjustments and fix that now. And to adjust this fence, I'm gonna use these Allen key bolts on either side of the fence. I'm actually going to, because it looks like the top needs to be lifted, I'm gonna go ahead and adjust this one over here a little bit. I'm gonna move it up slightly, do it until I don't see any light left. And that looks pretty good. All right, so now that we're square with our fence, we're going to square up the fence from front to back. I've seen some fences be set up so that they're canted out a little bit away from the blade. This way that when you're running a board through, it has some opportunity to get out of the way. I'm gonna set mine up so that it's perfectly parallel, just because that's the way I like my saw set up. But if you have a different preference, you can absolutely do so. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use my gauge. I'm gonna switch miter slots here over to the right side miter slot. And again, if you don't have a gauge, you can use that block and square method. That works great. I'm gonna start at the front of the fence and 0 out our dial, push it to the back of the fence, and it looks like we're about 9 thou off. That means that the fence needs to be canted inward a little bit, so we're gonna make those adjustments on the bottom of the fence. So to get there, we're gonna take our fence, we're gonna set it on top of the saw, and there's gonna be these 2 Allen bolts on either side, and we're going to adjust them based off of which way we need to go. And since I need the fence to go more in this way, I'm gonna adjust this right side bolt. Tighten it slightly. Now that our fence is all squared up and our blade is all squared up, I'm gonna look at my insert and make sure that it's square to the top of the saw. Now, this insert has 4 Allen key bolts at the top. Some inserts have the Allen key bolts underneath. What you're gonna wanna do is grab a square and just run it over top of your insert to make sure that it's not catching. Your square should sit flat from your table saw top to the insert. And as you can see here, I've got a little bit of play. So I'm gonna drop this down a little bit and get everything lined back up. Now that we got our insert set up, we're gonna check the 90 and 45-degree stops to make sure those are in place. I've already set them up on this saw, so they should be good, but if they're not, then I'll show you where you can make those adjustments. First thing we wanna do is we wanna take a square and put it in between the teeth of our saw blade to make sure it's sitting flat, and then raise that blade up so we can see, and that is set to 90, and I'm checking my stop here, and that is dead on. That just stopped at 90. Just check it one more time. So our 45 looks good, our 90 looks good. But if they didn't, you're gonna make the adjustment to the 90 right here on this bolt and the 45 on that bolt straight down there. All right guys, so that about wraps it up. Now your table saw should be cutting a lot cleaner with less burning and more accurate, which means you'll be a happier woodworker. So if you enjoyed this one, check out the next video in the series here, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you next time.